Part 1. The First Taste. When I was 6, I stood at the edge of the fairgrounds, holding my father's hand. His grip was firm, but his expression was soft. He pointed to a stall selling caramel apples, and for a fleeting moment, life seemed impossibly normal. But my father wasn't like other dads. The man's body was in the river 2 weeks later, bloated and unrecognizable except for the distinctive scar on his cheek. My father's work. At the time, I didn't understand the darkness festering within him. I only knew that people sometimes vanished, and that he never spoke about it. That darkness became mine on the cold October evening when I turned 19. My initiation was unplanned. I'd been wandering the streets of Cleveland, restless, my pockets empty, when I noticed him, a middle-aged man in a leather jacket, smoking on the stoop of an apartment building. He had a casual arrogance, the way he leaned back like he owned the sidewalk. I remember thinking, he thinks he's untouchable. By then, I'd been teetering on the edge for years. I knew my thoughts weren't normal. I'd fantasized, dissected the idea of power and control, but I'd never acted. Not until that night. I followed him for 3 blocks. He never noticed me. That made it easy. The alley smelled of damp trash and mildew. I had no plan, just a stolen knife and a tidal wave of adrenaline. When he turned around, my hand was already raised. His expression shifted from annoyance to confusion, and finally to fear. The knife went in deeper than I expected. He dropped instantly, clutching at the wound in his abdomen. Blood poured out, hot and sticky, soaking his shirt. I froze, the realization of what I'd done slamming into me like a freight train. But then, the fear evaporated, replaced by something darker, something that felt like coming home. I crouched beside him, hands trembling as I pressed the blade to his throat. His eyes locked on mine, wide and pleading. "Please," he whispered. "I have." The rest of his sentence gurgled into silence as the knife completed its arc. The aftermath was chaos. My chest was heaving. My ears rang with static. But amid the panic, there was a strange clarity. I knew what I had to do. I dragged his body into the shadows and worked quickly, slicing and carving, separating muscle from bone with a precision that surprised even me. It wasn't the gore that fascinated me. It was the warmth of the flesh, the realization that every piece had a purpose. That night, I carried home a duffel bag filled with my trophy. For hours, I sat in my dimly lit apartment, staring at it, the enormity of what I'd done sinking in. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, but not for the frozen pizza in the fridge. This was different, primal. When the first bite passed my lips, I expected revulsion. Instead, I felt nothing. Then, as the flavor registered, a wave of euphoria crashed over me. It was sweet, metallic, electric. Every nerve in my body sang. It wasn't about the taste. It was about the act, the ultimate power over another human being, the way it made me feel invincible. The next day, the news barely registered. Man found dead in alleyway. Suspected robbery gone wrong. No witnesses. No leads. I went about my routine like nothing had happened. Work, errands, small talk with neighbors. I was invisible, just another face in the crowd. And that's when I realized this was my gift. Nobody suspected me. Nobody ever would. As I washed the blood from my hands that night, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were sharper, my jawline harder. I didn't feel like prey anymore. Part 2. The next course. It didn't take long for the high from my first kill to wear off. The euphoria was replaced by a gnawing emptiness that no amount of distraction could fill. Food tasted like ash. Sleep was restless. I walked through life with an invisible leash tightening around my throat, pulling me toward the inevitable. At first, I convinced myself I could hold back. The craving was just a phase, a mistake I'd only made once. But the memories lingered, the taste, the rush of control, the way the world seemed sharper, more vivid. Soon, I wasn't fighting the hunger. I was feeding it in my mind, letting it grow. I needed another. This time, I was careful. The first had been spontaneous, reckless, and while it had gone unnoticed, I couldn't rely on luck again. If I was going to do this, and I knew now I would, it had to be methodical. I started frequenting places where people went unnoticed. Bars, train stations, strip malls. My eyes scanned the crowds for potential targets. No one too remarkable. No one who'd leave behind a flurry of mourners or headlines. Someone ordinary, easily forgotten. It was in the parking lot of a 24-hour gym that I found her. She was mid-30s, dressed in neon workout gear, her ponytail swinging as she walked to her car. Her phone was in one hand, a water bottle in the other. She had that air of confidence, the kind that made her seem untouchable. That's what drew me in, the unshakable belief that she was safe. I followed her as she unlocked her car. The parking lot was empty, save for a flickering streetlight casting long, distorted shadows. I waited until she opened the driver's side door, her back to me, before stepping forward. "Excuse me," I started, my voice steady but low. She turned, startled, and for a split second, I saw the calculation in her eyes. Man, late 20s, not visibly threatening, standing just out of reach. Her face relaxed. "Yes." The knife was in my hand before she could react. "Get in the car," I said, my tone shifting to something colder, more commanding. Her eyes widened. "What? Now?" She didn't scream. Most people don't, not at first. It's as though their brain refuses to process the danger until it's too late. She obeyed, sliding into the driver's seat, and I followed her in, shutting the door behind me. The air inside the car was suffocating, thick with her fear. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I have kids." I wasn't interested in her life story. The point wasn't her. It was what she represented. Power, control, drive. I ordered, pressing the knife against her side. We didn't go far. Just a few blocks to a secluded construction site I'd scouted earlier. The machinery was silent, the lot empty. I told her to stop the car and get out. She stumbled as she exited, her knees buckling beneath her. "Please don't do this," she begged, tears streaming down her face. For a brief moment, I hesitated. Not because I felt remorse, I didn't, but because I was savoring it, the anticipation. Her life was in my hands, dangling by a thread I could cut at any moment. When the knife struck, it was swift. One thrust to the abdomen, then another and another. She crumpled to the ground, her hands grasping at the wounds, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The final cut was deliberate, slicing cleanly across her throat. The aftermath was a blur of adrenaline and precision. I worked quickly, moving her body to the trunk of her car and driving it to the edge of town. There, in the cover of darkness, I dismembered her with practiced care, separating the pieces I needed from the ones I'd discard. I buried what I couldn't use in a shallow grave near the woods. By the time I returned to my apartment, the sun was beginning to rise. My hands shook as I laid out the meat, wrapping each piece meticulously before placing it in the freezer. This time, I knew better than to gorge myself. I rationed it, savoring each bite like a religious sacrament. The taste was the same, sweet, metallic, electric, but now it carried something more. The knowledge that this was who I was. The news broke 2 days later. Missing gym patron's car found abandoned. The police were baffled, their theories scattered. A robbery gone wrong? A carjacking? No one mentioned anything about cannibalism. I was untouchable. That night, as I prepared another meal, I stared at the raw flesh on my cutting board. I could feel the hunger stirring again, faint but insistent. I smiled. This wasn't a craving anymore. This was life. Part 3. The hunter becomes the hunted. I'd thought I was invincible. The second kill had gone smoother than the first, the planning meticulous, the execution perfect. But what no one warns you about is how quickly confidence turns into complacency. The hunger was easier to manage now, less feral, more predictable. I set rules and stuck to them. Once every 3 months. No deviations. It wasn't just about staying off the radar, it was about discipline. Indulgence was the fastest path to exposure, and I wasn't about to let arrogance undo me. The third time I chose a man, late 40s, wiry build, an ex-con by the looks of his tattoos. I followed him from a dive bar in a seedy part of town. He'd stumbled out alone, lighting a cigarette as he leaned against the brick wall. Perfect, I thought. A man like that wouldn't be missed. Not right away, at least. But things didn't go according to plan. I approached him in the alley behind the bar, the knife tucked discreetly in my jacket. "Got a light?" I asked, playing the part of the casual passerby. He turned to me, his eyes bloodshot, and smirked. "Sure, kid." As he pulled out his lighter, I stepped closer. My heart was pounding, the familiar adrenaline kicking in, but I kept my hand steady. One quick thrust, I reminded myself, in and out like the others. The moment my hand moved, he caught it. His grip was like a vice, crushing my wrist as he twisted the knife from my hand. I froze, stunned, as he laughed, a deep, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "Nice try," he said, pocketing the knife. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're not the only predator around here." Before I could react, he shoved me against the wall, his forearm pressing hard against my throat. "You've been sloppy, kid," he said, his voice low. "Real sloppy. You think no one notices when people like you pop up?" My mind raced. How did he know? Had he been watching me? Was he one of them, a killer like me? He leaned in closer, his breath hot against my ear. "You're not the first I've come across. You won't be the last. But you've got potential." I didn't wait to find out what he meant. Survival instinct kicked in, and I drove my knee into his stomach hard. He grunted, his grip loosening just enough for me to break free. I ran, my chest burning, the sound of his laughter echoing behind me. When I reached the main road, I forced myself to slow down, blending into the sparse crowd. My mind was a storm of questions. Who was he? How had I missed the signs? I couldn't go home. Not yet. Instead, I ducked into a diner, ordering coffee I didn't touch as I sat in the far corner, scanning every face that walked in. Hours passed, and no one came for me. But the paranoia lingered. A week later, the envelope arrived. It was on my doorstep when I got home from work, a plain manila envelope with no return address. My heart sank as I picked it up, a cold sweat breaking out on my neck. Inside was a single photograph. It was me walking away from the second victim's car, my hoodie pulled low over my face. On the back of the photo was a message, scrawled in jagged handwriting. "Next time, don't take so long to clean up. We'll be watching." For the first time, I felt fear, not just the thrill of risk, but genuine, bone-deep terror. Someone new. Someone had been watching me, studying me. But instead of turning me in, they were taunting me. My instincts screamed at me to run, to disappear. But I knew it wouldn't matter. Whoever they were, they'd find me. The only way to regain control was to confront the threat head-on. I started frequenting the dive bar again, hoping to spot the man. Days turned into weeks with no sign of him. But then one night, I noticed someone new. A woman sitting at the bar, nursing a whiskey. She wasn't the type to frequent a place like this. Clean cut, polished, wearing a fitted blazer that screamed corporate. She didn't belong here. When she caught me looking, she smiled. We talked for hours, her name a blur in the haze of cheap drinks and careful flirting. She said she was new in town, just exploring. She seemed harmless, charming even. But when she excused herself to the restroom, I noticed something on the counter where her phone had been. A keychain shaped like a knife, engraved with the same jagged handwriting as the note. My pulse quickened as I realized the truth. She wasn't here by coincidence. She was one of them. I left before she returned, disappearing into the night. But the game had changed. They weren't just watching me anymore. They were hunting me. Part 4. Into the trap. I couldn't sleep. Every shadow in my apartment felt like a watcher. Every creak of the floorboards, a step closer to my undoing. The paranoia wasn't an illusion. Someone was out there. Someone who had seen my work, who knew my rules, my habits. And they weren't just observing. They were testing me, pushing me toward an edge I couldn't see. I thought about the woman at the bar, her polished smile, and that damn keychain. Was she the brains behind this? Or just another pawn in their game? For the first time in my life, I felt the bitter sting of powerlessness. I knew they were waiting for me to slip up. That was the whole point of the photograph, the keychain, the taunts, to rattle me, force me into a mistake. They wanted to see if I could keep my cool. But what they didn't know was that I could play games too. If they wanted to hunt me, I'd let them. But I wouldn't be their prey. I started watching the dive bar from the shadows across the street. Every evening, I waited, my hood pulled low, my eyes scanning the crowd for any familiar faces. The man, the woman, neither returned. What did show up, however, was another envelope. This time, it was taped to my car windshield. Inside was a single note. Tuesday, 10 p.m. The reservoir. Come alone. I stared at the note for hours, turning it over in my hands, waiting for some hidden meaning to emerge. It was too obvious, too theatrical. A meet-up at a secluded spot? It practically screamed trap. But not going wasn't an option. This wasn't just about them. It was about control. If I ignored the invitation, they'd only escalate. They wanted me to feel cornered, so I'd let them think they'd succeeded. Tuesday came, and I made my preparations. A knife, duct tape, gloves, and a burner phone. Standard tools tucked neatly into a black backpack. The reservoir was as desolate as expected. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, the moonlight casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. My boots crunched against the gravel as I walked, each step deliberate and measured. It was 10:03 when I saw her, the woman from the bar. She stood by the water's edge, her blazer replaced with a leather jacket, her arms crossed. The wind whipped her hair around her face, but her expression was unreadable. "Right on time," she said, her voice steady. I stopped a few yards away, keeping my hands visible but ready. "What do you want?" She smiled a small, knowing grin. "You've been making waves. Let's call it a recruitment process." Recruitment? The word caught me off guard, twisting my unease into something sharper. "You think I want to join you?" I asked, my voice cold. "Oh, it's not about what you want," she said, taking a step closer. "It's about what you need. Someone like you? You can't survive alone. You're too good to waste on sloppiness. Too smart for prison." Her words hung in the air, bait wrapped in false praise. "What happens if I say no?" The smile faded. "Then you'll meet the others." I didn't need to ask what that meant. The weight in her tone made it clear enough. If I refused, they'd stop playing games. They'd eliminate me. And yet, even with her warning, there was a flicker of something behind her eyes. A challenge, maybe, or hesitation. She was testing me, but there was a vulnerability there, too. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us. "You've been watching me." "Why?" Her gaze didn't waver. "Because you're not like the others. You're careful, deliberate, but you lack discipline. That's where we come in." "Wait." She tilted her head, gesturing toward the tree lane. "Show yourself." The man from the alley emerged, his wiry frame cutting through the shadows. He held my knife in his hand, spinning it lazily as he approached. "Miss me," he said, his grin as sharp as the blade. I forced myself to stay calm, even as my pulse quickened. This was worse than I'd imagined. Two predators both sizing me up. "I'll give you one chance," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Work with us. You'll have resources, protection. No more hiding in the dark." Or, the man grinned wider, flipping the knife into a reverse grip. "We'll see how long you last out here on your own." I weighed my options, the silence stretching between us like a taut wire. Giving in meant submitting to their control, becoming part of something I didn't understand. Refusing meant war, one I wasn't sure I could win. But then it hit me. They weren't here to recruit me. They were here to assess me. This was another test, and if they wanted to see what I was capable of, I'd show them. I shifted my weight, letting my shoulders relax. "All right," I said, my voice steady. "I'll play along. For now." The woman studied me, her eyes narrowing. She didn't trust me, not completely. "Smart choice," she said finally. The man, however, wasn't as convinced. "You really think this kid has what it takes?" he asked, his tone mocking. She didn't answer, but her gaze never left mine. The three of us walked back toward the tree line, tension coiling around us like a snake. As we approached their vehicle, I slowed my pace, calculating. The knife was still in his hand, the blade catching the moonlight. It would be quick, precise. The moment he turned his back, I struck. The blade sank into his side, his gasp barely audible before I twisted it. He collapsed, and I turned to face her, adrenaline surging. But she was faster than I'd anticipated. Her gun was already drawn, her finger on the trigger. "You just made a very big mistake," she said, her voice icy. And for the first time, I saw the faintest hint of fear in her eyes. Part 5. The devil you know. The gun didn't waver. She stood there, her finger resting lightly on the trigger, her eyes locked on mine. For a moment, neither of us moved, the only sound the rasp of the dying man at my feet. "You really don't listen," she said, her voice sharp. "That was your last chance." I didn't answer. My mind raced, calculating my next move. She had me at gunpoint, but hesitation lingered in her gaze. She wasn't ready to kill me. Not yet. The trick was to make her think I was just as dangerous as they thought I was. "Go ahead," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "Pull the trigger." She tilted her head, her lips curling into a smirk. "Brave." "No," I said, stepping over the man's body. "Practical. If you kill me, what happens next? You drag 2 corpses out of here and explain to your crew how you failed to recruit me." Her grip on the gun tightened, but she didn't shoot. "I know your type," I continued. "This isn't about killing me. It's about control. If I walk out of here, it's because you let me. That's the only power you're interested in." Her jaw clenched. I'd hit a nerve. The air between us was electric, heavy with unspoken threats. Finally, she exhaled, lowering the gun slightly. "You're smarter than you look," she admitted. "But that's not enough." "Then why are we still talking?" "Because you're not walking out of here unless I say so." She holstered the gun, her eyes cold. "Clean him up. Now!" I looked down at the man's body, the blood pooling beneath him. The knife still protruded from his side, the blade glinting under the moonlight. "You want me to clean up your mess?" I asked, my voice steady. Her expression didn't falter. "No. I want you to prove you're worth saving." It was a test, another one. She wanted to see how far I'd go, how well I'd follow orders. But what she didn't understand was that I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was playing the long game. I crouched beside the body, pulling the knife free in one smooth motion. The man twitched, his breathing shallow. He wasn't dead yet. "Finish him," she said, her tone indifferent. My hand hovered over the knife, my pulse pounding. Killing him wasn't the problem. It was the ease with which she ordered it, the casual cruelty in her voice. I looked up at her, meeting her gaze. "You want this done? You do it." For the first time, her mask slipped. She blinked, taken aback by my defiance. "You're testing me," I said. "But I'm testing you too. You need me? Prove it." Her smirk returned, colder now. "Cute. But you're not the one in charge." She stepped closer, her hand resting on the gun at her hip. I stood slowly, the knife still in my hand. We were a foot apart now, the tension between us razor thin. "Make your move," I said, my voice low. "Show me how much power you really have." For a moment, I thought she might actually draw the gun. But instead, she laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "You've got guts," she said. "I'll give you that." She turned and walked away, leaving me standing over the body. I didn't move until I heard her car engine start, the headlights cutting through the trees. Only then did I allow myself to exhale, the knife slipping from my fingers. The man on the ground groaned, his breath shallow. I looked down at him, considering. He was dead either way. She'd make sure of it, whether I did the job or not. So I left him there. The walk back to my apartment felt like a lifetime. Every step was weighed down by the realization that I was in over my head. They weren't just predators. They were organized, methodical. And I just made an enemy of their leader. When I reached my building, the hallway felt suffocating, the shadows pressing in from every corner. My door was ajar. Someone had been inside. The living room was untouched, the furniture just as I'd left it. But on the coffee table, a single item stood out. My burner phone. It wasn't where I'd left it. I picked it up, my stomach twisting. There was a single new message. "You're on borrowed time. Make it count." I smashed the phone against the wall, the pieces scattering across the floor. They weren't just testing me anymore. They were closing in, tightening the noose. I needed a plan. The next day, I left town. I'd always prided myself on blending in, disappearing into the noise of the city. But now, I was a fugitive in my own skin, hunted by people who were better at the game than I'd ever imagined. I drove west, avoiding highways and surveillance cameras, switching plates when I could. Every stop felt like a risk, every stranger a potential threat. And yet, the hunger still gnawed at me. It would have been easy to let it consume me, to make another kill and risk exposure. But I couldn't afford to be sloppy. Not now. Days turned into weeks, the road stretching endlessly ahead. I stayed in motels, paying in cash, keeping to myself. But the messages kept coming. They found me no matter where I went. Notes slipped under doors, strange faces watching from across parking lots. They wanted me to know I couldn't run, so I stopped running. The final note came on a cold November night, pinned to the windshield of my car. Let's finish this. Midnight, Warehouse 17. There was no signature, but I didn't need one. I knew who it was from, and I knew this time only one of us was walking away. Part 6, the final stage. The warehouse loomed like a ghost on the edge of the industrial district, its jagged silhouette cutting into the night sky. A flickering street lamp cast pale light over the rusted metal walls, making the shadows twist and dance. This was it, Warehouse 17. My car was parked 3 blocks away, hidden behind a row of abandoned buildings. I'd walked the rest of the way, knife tucked inside my jacket, duct tape wrapped around my hands to secure my grip. The note hadn't specified whether to come armed, but I wasn't about to take chances. I slipped through the side entrance, the door creaking on its hinges. Inside, the air was cold and thick with the smell of oil and decay. My footsteps echoed softly as I moved through the cavernous space, my eyes scanning every corner. It was quiet, too quiet. No hum of machinery, no whisper of wind through the cracks. Just silence. And then a voice. "You're late." She stepped out from the shadows, her leather jacket catching the dim light. The woman from the bar, no longer coy, no longer hiding. Her gun was holstered at her side, but her posture was sharp, ready. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said, her voice carrying across the empty space. I stopped a few feet away, keeping my distance. "You didn't leave me much of a choice." She smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, you always have a choice. That's what makes this fun." I scanned the room, looking for others, but she seemed to be alone. No backup, no traps. "You've been following me for weeks," I said, my voice steady. "Why?" She tilted her head, studying me like a specimen under a microscope. "You know why? You're not like the rest of them. You've got potential, but potential only matters if you know how to use it. And you think you're going to teach me?" Her smirk widened. "Something like that." She gestured to a metal chair, bolted to the floor in the center of the room. A single bare bulb hung above it, casting a harsh spotlight. "Take a seat," she said. I didn't move. "What's the game this time?" Her hand rested on her gun, a silent warning. "You've made it this far. Don't ruin it by being stubborn." Reluctantly, I stepped forward, my knife still hidden in my jacket. The chair was cold and unforgiving as I sat, the metal biting into my skin. She circled me slowly, her boots clicking against the concrete. "You've got the instincts," she said, "the hunger, but you're reckless. Sloppy. That's going to get you killed." I forced myself to stay calm, my fingers curling around the knife's handle. "And you think working with you is the solution?" She stopped in front of me, leaning in close. "It's the only solution. You don't get to walk away from this. Not alive, anyway." Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. But I wasn't about to let her have the last word. I moved fast, pulling the knife and lunging at her in one fluid motion. She was quicker. The gun was out before I reached her, the barrel pressing against my temple. "Nice try," she said, her tone amused. My breath came in sharp bursts, the adrenaline surging through me. She didn't shoot. Instead, she stepped back, lowering the gun. "I like your fire," she said, "but you've got a lot to learn." She gestured to the far end of the warehouse, where a metal door creaked open. 2 figures stepped through, their faces obscured by shadows. One of them dragged a 3rd figure behind them, a man, bound and gagged, his eyes wide with terror. "This is your test," she said, her voice cold. The man was forced into the light, his breathing ragged. He looked ordinary, unremarkable. "Kill him," she said, her gaze locked on mine. The room seemed to close in around me, the weight of her command pressing down like a vice. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Her expression didn't change. "You don't have a choice." I stood, the knife still in my hand. "This isn't about me. It's about you proving you can break me." Her smirk returned, sharper than ever. Maybe, or maybe it's about survival. The two figures stepped closer, their faces finally visible. One was the man from the alley, alive, though his side was bandaged. The other was a woman I didn't recognize, her eyes cold and calculating. They blocked the exits, their presence a silent threat. "You think you're the hunter," she said, "but you're just prey, playing a role you barely understand. Show me you're more than that." The man on the floor whimpered, his eyes pleading. I stared at him, my grip on the knife tightening. But instead of striking, I turned the blade on her, pointing it at her chest. "I'll make you a deal," I said, my voice steady. "Let him go, and I'll work with you." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You're not in a position to bargain." "Maybe not," I said. "But if you wanted me dead, I'd be dead already." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension palpable. Then, she lowered her gun. "Interesting," she said. "You might just be worth keeping after all." She gestured to the others, and they dragged the man away, his muffled cries echoing in the distance. "This isn't over," she said, her eyes narrowing. "But you bought yourself some time." As they disappeared into the shadows, I stood alone in the warehouse, the knife still in my hand. For the first time, I realized the truth. I wasn't just surviving their game. I was starting to win. Part 7, Predator's Feast. The warehouse was silent again, save for the faint echo of footsteps retreating into the night. I stood there, knife in hand, the taste of adrenaline sharp in my throat. They thought I was beaten, tamed. They were wrong. I wasn't walking out of here a pawn in their game. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about dominance. I had one rule left, and it was the simplest one. No one leaves alive. The first to die was the woman. She turned to follow the others, her back to me, her guard down. Rookie mistake. I moved quickly, silently. The knife slid into her neck with surgical precision, cutting off her startled gasp before it could become a scream. She collapsed, her blood pooling around her. The others hadn't noticed yet. The man from the alley was next. He was tougher, his instincts sharper. When I approached, he turned, catching the glint of the blade. "You," he snarled, raising a crowbar he'd been carrying. The clash was brutal, metal against knife, our grunts echoing in the empty space. He was strong, but he was also injured. That gave me the edge I needed. I dodged his next swing, stepping inside his reach and driving the blade deep into his gut. His eyes widened, his grip faltering. "Should have stayed dead," I whispered, pulling the knife free. He crumpled to the ground, his blood joining hers. That left her, the leader. She wasn't far. Her voice carried through the shadows, barking orders to someone I couldn't see. "Check the exits," she shouted. "He's still here." I slipped into the shadows, my heart pounding. She was dangerous, calculated, unflinching. Killing her wouldn't be easy, but I wasn't going to let her escape. She moved with purpose, her gun drawn, scanning the darkness. I stayed low, circling her, waiting for the right moment. "Do you really think you can take us all?" she called out, her voice echoing. "You're outnumbered, outgunned. Just give up, and I might let you live." I didn't answer. Words were wasted on her. Instead, I waited until she passed a stack of crates, her attention focused elsewhere. Then I struck. The knife caught her shoulder, drawing a sharp cry of pain. She spun, firing blindly, the shot sparking against the metal crates. I ducked, closing the distance between us before she could aim again. The struggle was violent, primal. She was strong, her blows landing hard, but I was faster. I knocked the gun from her hand, sending it skittering across the floor. She lunged at me, a makeshift blade in her hand. I dodged, grabbing her wrist and twisting until the weapon fell. She fought like a cornered animal, her eyes wild. But in the end, it didn't matter. I overpowered her, pinning her to the ground. This was never about recruitment, was it? I said, my voice low. Her lips curled into a bloody smirk. "You think you've won? You're just another monster. They'll come for you, just like they came for me." "I'm counting on it," I said, and drove the knife in her chest. Her body went limp, her smirk fading as her life drained away. The warehouse was quiet again, the bodies around me still. The air was thick with the scent of blood. the metallic tang settling into my lungs. But it wasn't over. Not yet. I dragged her body to the center of the room, setting it on the metal chair beneath the harsh light. Her face was pale, her features frozen in defiance. Then, I began the process. The first cut was always the hardest, but once I started, the ritual took over. My hands moved with practiced precision, separating muscle from bone, harvesting what I needed. The hunger roared to life, primal and insistent. I didn't fight it. By the time I finished, the chair was empty. I ate in silence, the taste of her flesh filling the void she'd tried to create in me. It was sweeter than I expected, tinged with the bitter satisfaction of victory. But there was no time to savor it. I had to leave. The cleanup was quick, but thorough. I doused the bodies in the warehouse in gasoline, the sharp fumes stinging my nose. As I struck the match and watched the flames consume everything, I felt a strange sense of closure. She was right. I was a monster, but I was a monster who'd won. The next morning, I was on a plane to South America, a new passport in my pocket and a new identity waiting for me on the other side. But the game wasn't over. The first message arrived 2 weeks later, slid under the door of my rented apartment in Buenos Aires. "We're coming." They wouldn't stop, not until one of us was dead, and I wouldn't have it any other way.